"I can't pay you." The obese girl. Panicked, the mountain man smiled. "Work with me, not for me." The Bitterroot Mountains, in the winter of 1823, were a study in desolation. Snow fell thick and unforgiving, covering the narrow trail that wound through the rocky passes like a burial shroud. The settlement of Timber Creek, nestled in a valley between towering peaks, consisted of no more than 30 structures, a trading post, a saloon, a small church, and scattered cabins where hardy souls had chosen to make their lives in this unforgiving wilderness. Martha Hale had never intended to end up here. 3 months ago, she had possessed what she considered stability, a position as a chambermaid and occasional cook at the Westbound Inn in Sacramento, a respectable establishment owned by a man named Theodore Marsh. Theodore had been charismatic in the way that dishonest men often are, all charm and promise until the moment the truth collapsed like a house of cards. He had borrowed from suppliers, from the bank, from anyone foolish enough to trust his assurances that the business would flourish. When the creditors came calling, Theodore Marsh simply disappeared, leaving behind a wreckage of unpaid debts and ruined lives. Martha had found herself in an impossible situation. As one of the few permanent staff members, creditors and lawyers had fixed their attention upon her with the single-minded determination of wolves scenting blood. They didn't care that she earned barely enough to feed herself, that she owned nothing of value. They wanted payment, recompense, someone to suffer for Theodore's abandonment. She had tried to explain, to beg for mercy, but compassion was a commodity in short supply. The innkeeper's wife had suggested, with a thin smile and hollow eyes, that perhaps Martha should consider other ways of settling the debt. The implication had been clear and sickening. That was when Martha knew she had to leave. She had taken what little she possessed, a worn dress, a shawl, a small bag of cornmeal, and $3 she had hidden away, and simply walked away from Sacramento. She walked east, toward the mountains, believing that distance itself might be a form of redemption. The journey had been brutal. Other travelers she'd encountered on the road had been uniformly unkind. A wagon driver had offered her passage, but demanded payment in forms she refused to give. A family heading to a settlement had turned her away, calling her trouble as if hardship were contagious. She had slept in barns and under trees, eaten what she could find or beg. By the time she reached Timber Creek in late December, she was hollow-eyed with exhaustion, her body racked with fever, her mind barely holding on to coherence. She had collapsed on the steps of a cabin on the outskirts of town, the cabin of Elias Boone, though she wouldn't learn his name until later. Elias Boone had been chopping wood when he nearly tripped over her. He was a man of nearly 50 years, weathered by decades of mountain life, with the kind of face that told stories, some of them violent, most of them sorrowful. His beard was iron gray, his shoulders still broad beneath layers of worn flannel and deerskin. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held a wariness that had been earned through hard experience. He had come to the mountains in 1805, fleeing a life in the settled East that had left him broken. He had been a surveyor, a man of learning, until the woman he loved had married another while he was away on assignment. He had tried to drown that pain in whiskey and work, but eventually he realized he needed distance, not from the woman, but from the entire structure of society that had failed him. The mountains had called to him like a siren song, and he had answered. For nearly 20 years, he had lived in voluntary solitude. He trapped furs, hunted game, maintained his small cabin with meticulous care. He had learned to read the language of snow and wind, to understand the rhythms of seasons and animals. He had become, as the people of Timber Creek said, the mountain man, a figure more legend than flesh, someone to avoid, someone dangerous because he was unknowable. The townspeople left him alone, which was exactly as he preferred it. He came to the trading post once a month for salt, ammunition, and kerosene. He traded his furs for goods. He spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. The few women who had attempted to befriend him or suggest courtship had been firmly rebuffed. Elias Boone, they said in the saloon, didn't have it in him to be civilized anymore. So when he found Martha on his doorstep, collapsed and burning with fever, his first instinct was annoyance. But he was not a cruel man, only a cautious one. After a moment of hesitation, he picked her up, noting her surprising weight, her small size despite the roundness of her body, which suggested she hadn't eaten well in some time, and carried her inside. He laid her on his bed, moved himself to a chair by the fire, and began the process of trying to keep her alive. He gave her water with yarrow and willow bark to break the fever. He cleaned the cuts on her feet. He sat through 2 nights watching her, prepared to carry her body back to town if necessary, but also, though he would never have admitted it, hoping she would survive. There was something in her face that moved him, despite his best efforts to remain unmoved by anything. In her sleep she cried out names, her mother perhaps, or friends long dead, and twisted with nightmares. Her body fought for life with the kind of desperation that spoke of someone who had been close to losing everything. On the 3rd day, her eyes opened. Martha regained consciousness slowly, becoming aware first of warmth, then of softness beneath her, then of the crackle of a fire. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small cabin with a low ceiling, smoke-darkened walls, and a large figure sitting by the window, repairing what looked like a leather harness. The man looked up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Martha felt the familiar spike of fear in her chest. She was alone with a strange man, unwell and defenseless. The man's face was impossible to read. "Welcome back," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "You've been asleep for 2 days. You had a fever." He set down his harness work and stood, moving to a small table where a pot of soup simmered. "You need to eat." He brought her a bowl of broth, thick with vegetables and what tasted like venison. Martha held it with both hands, which shook with residual weakness, and drank it slowly. It was perhaps the best thing she had ever tasted. "What's your name?" the man asked, settling back into his chair. "Martha," she said. "Martha Hale." Then, her mind clearing slightly with the warmth of the soup in her belly, panic began to rise. I can't pay you. I have nothing. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I don't know how I got here." "You collapsed on my doorstep," he said simply. "I brought you inside. You were sick. I helped you get better. That's the way of things." "But there must be something you want," Martha said, and there was an edge of old terror in her voice. "Everyone wants something. I'll work, The man held up a hand, and something in his eyes, a flash of understanding perhaps, or a recognition of pain, made her fall silent. "My name is Elias Boone," he said. "And no, I don't want anything from you, not like that." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I want you to rest, get stronger. Then, if you've nowhere else to go, I could use some help around here." Martha's breath caught. "Help? Doing what?" Elias gestured around the cabin. "Cooking, when you're able. Mending. There's work to do if you're willing to work. But I'm not interested in... That's not what I need." He looked directly at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something that looked like honesty. "I need someone to talk to at dinner, someone to laugh at my jokes, which are terrible, someone who isn't afraid of the dark or the snow, someone who can sit by a fire and just be. I've been alone too long." Martha felt tears prick her eyes, and she didn't entirely understand why. Perhaps it was the remnants of fever, or perhaps it was simply that after months of being treated as a commodity or a problem, someone had offered her something that looked like simple kindness. "I'd like that," she whispered. The first weeks were about learning. Martha learned the rhythm of the cabin, the way the light fell through the window in the morning, how the wood fire needed tending every few hours, the locations of every pot, pan, and utensil in Elias's modest kitchen. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and black, that he preferred stew to roasted meat, that he hummed while he worked. Old songs, she thought, from somewhere in his past, sung in a voice that had largely forgotten music. For his part, Elias learned that Martha snored when she was deeply asleep, that she was terrified of guns. He kept his rifle unloaded and stored away. That she could sing, though she only did so when she thought he wasn't listening. He learned that she was kind to the cabin's old dog, a hound named Ranger, who had been his only companion for 7 years. He learned that beneath the weight she carried, there was a woman of surprising grace and determination. The cabin had 2 rooms, the main living space with kitchen and sitting area, and a small back room where Elias had slept for decades. When Martha recovered enough to wonder where she would sleep, Elias matter-of-factly carried bedding into the main room and set up a sleeping area near the fire. There was nothing sexual or uncomfortable about the arrangement. He treated her as he might have treated a lost relative, with practical care and genuine concern. Martha began to recover, not just physically, but spiritually. The terror that had lived in her chest for so long began to ease. She wasn't constantly braced for betrayal or harm. She ate regularly. She slept well. Slowly, her body changed. The sharp edges of starvation softened. Her face became fuller, healthier. Her hair, which she washed now with soap from Elias's supplies, grew shiny and thick. One morning in late January, Elias showed her how to check the traps he maintained in the mountains surrounding the cabin. They walked through snow so bright it hurt to look at, their breath-making clouds in the frozen air, following a path that only Elias seemed to see. He moved with the grace of someone who had spent decades learning to read the landscape. He pointed out the signs of animals, a fox's tracks, a deer's path, the marks where a lynx had killed. And Martha listened, fascinated, to his explanation of what each meant. "The mountains speak," he said, "if you know how to listen. Most people don't. They're too busy talking to hear anything." At one trap they found a rabbit, already beginning to freeze. Elias quickly and mercifully killed it, then showed Martha how to skin and prepare it. If she felt squeamish at first, she overcame it. This was real life, not the sanitized version served in restaurants. She learned that survival required you to understand the whole chain, from animal to table. That evening, she prepared rabbit stew, flavored with wild herbs she'd learned to identify. Elias tasted it slowly, then looked at her with something like wonder. "This is good, Martha," he said. "This is really good." She smiled, genuinely pleased, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A current of recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. February brought the first signs that winter might eventually release its grip. The snow became wet and heavy, then began to recede. At midday, the sun actually felt warm. The birds, gone for months, began to return. And with the thaw came a subtle transformation in the dynamic between Elias and Martha. It happened gradually, so gradually that neither of them could pinpoint the exact moment. Martha began to notice the way Elias's hands looked when he worked, the strength in them, the intelligence in his eyes. Elias began to notice that Martha hummed while she worked, and that sometimes, when she laughed at one of his terrible jokes, it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in decades. One evening in mid-February, Martha attempted to mend one of Elias's shirts. It was a simple task, replacing a button, but she didn't have experience with needlework. She struggled with the needle, pricking her finger repeatedly, becoming frustrated. Elias watched from his chair for a few moments, then stood and came to sit beside her. "May I?" he asked gently. Martha handed over both shirt and needle. Elias, much to her surprise, proved to be adept with the needle. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, and within minutes, the button was secured. "Where did you learn that?" Martha asked. "My mother taught me," Elias said, and his voice had that distant quality it took on when he spoke of his past. "She said a man should know how to care for himself. She was wise." He handed back the shirt. There." Good as new. Martha took the shirt and their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away immediately. When they did, it was slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging something they both understood but couldn't quite name. Elias, Martha said quietly, why did you help me? That first day. You didn't know me. I could have been dangerous or a thief or... Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion long suppressed. Because I knew what it was like, he said, to be cast aside by the world, to feel like you had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I swore years ago that if I ever had the chance to prevent someone from feeling that way, I would. He paused. And because when I looked at you, even through the fever and the fear, I saw someone worth saving. Martha felt her eyes burn with tears, but they were different tears than those that had come before. Not tears of despair, but tears of recognition and gratitude. I'm glad I collapsed on your doorstep, she whispered. Elias smiled, and it transformed his face, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been in another life, before pain had worn him down. So am I, Martha. So am I. By April, the mountains were alive again. New growth emerged from the earth. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The creek that ran near the cabin, dormant and slow in winter, now rushed and roared with snowmelt. It was a time of abundance and renewal, and it seemed to affect Elias and Martha in equal measure. They worked together to expand the cabin's small garden, preparing soil for vegetables. They repaired the roof, which had suffered under the weight of winter snow. They cut firewood for the following winter, working side by side in comfortable rhythm. And increasingly, their hands found excuses to touch, passing items back and forth, steadying one another on rough ground, brushing against each other in the close quarters of the cabin. It was Martha who finally spoke aloud what had been growing between them. She did it on a warm evening in late April, after they had finished dinner. Elias was sitting by the fire, and Martha stood at the window, looking out at the mountains bathed in golden sunset light. For months now, she'd been thinking about her past, about what had happened to her in Sacramento. The wound had healed somewhat, but it had also changed her understanding of who she was. She turned from the window to face Elias. Do you remember, she asked, when you told me you didn't want me to work for you, but to work with you? I do, Elias said, watching her carefully. I think, Martha said slowly, choosing her words with care, that I've been doing more than just working with you. I think I've been learning to live again, to trust again, to believe that kindness exists in this world. She took a breath. And I think I've fallen in love with you. Elias stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. For a moment, Martha worried she had made a terrible mistake, had presumed too much. But then he crossed the room and took her hands in his. I was terrified to let myself feel it, he said, his voice rough. After so many years of protecting myself, of believing that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. But Martha, you came into my life like a second spring, and you've thawed something in me that I thought was frozen forever. He lifted one of her hands to his chest, over his heart. I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment you opened your eyes and looked at me with such fear and such hope. Martha stepped closer, and Elias wrapped his arms around her. For a long moment, they simply held each other. When they kissed, it was gentle and tender, a promise rather than a passion, though passion would certainly come in time. The question of Martha's future came up naturally in the following weeks. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the stars emerge, Elias turned to her. Do you want to go back to town? He asked. To civilization? This is a hard life, Martha. Winters are brutal. There's no society here, no neighbors to visit. You could have a different life if you wanted it. Martha was quiet for a moment. She thought about Sacramento, about the inn, about the feeling of being trapped and desperate. She thought about the months of fear and wandering. Then she looked at the mountains, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and at Elias, the man who had saved her. "I don't want any life but this one," she said, "if you'll have me." Elias reached over and took her hand. "I'll have you, always." It wasn't a formal proposal, and there was no official ceremony. But in August, when a traveling minister passed through Timber Creek, Elias and Martha went to town and got married. Martha wore a simple dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, and Elias wore the one suit he had brought to the mountains decades before. The ceremony took place in the small church, witnessed by the curious inhabitants of Timber Creek, who were utterly fascinated by the union of the mysterious mountain man and the mysterious woman who had appeared months before. After the ceremony, there were knowing looks and whispered comments. Martha was already pregnant, you see, barely 4 months married, and already expecting. Not that anyone was surprised. The mountain man wouldn't have done things in any other order, but it was still food for the gossip mill. By the following spring, Martha had given birth to a daughter they named Eleanor. The birth was difficult and nearly cost Martha her life, and Elias discovered reserves of courage and determination he didn't know he possessed as he played both midwife and comforter, helping his wife bring their child into the world. Eleanor had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. She was a beautiful baby, and Elias found himself transformed by fatherhood. The man who had said he needed only solitude and self-sufficiency now spent hours holding his daughter, showing her the world, whispering stories of the mountains and the animals that lived in them. Martha recovered more slowly than expected from the birth, and for a time she was fragile and uncertain. But Elias's patience and care brought her back. He took over much of the work around the cabin. He learned to cook more dishes so that Martha could rest. He cared for Eleanor during the long nights when she cried with colic. And through it all, he looked at both his wife and daughter with an expression of such gratitude that Martha's heart would catch. 2 years later, they had a son named James after Martha's father. James was born more easily than Eleanor, as if Martha's body now knew what to do. He was a placid baby, content to watch the world with serious eyes, and Elias would often find the boy sitting on his lap while the father worked on mending or carving, both of them in companionable silence. The cabin, which had seemed so small when Martha first arrived, expanded. Elias built a new room for the children, careful and precise in his work. He built shelves for Martha's growing collection of books. She had begun ordering them from the trading post, and it became one of her great joys to read aloud to the children by firelight. He built a proper bedroom for the master of the house, separate from the living space, allowing them privacy and comfort. Their life was not easy. Winter still came harsh and unforgiving. There were nights when Eleanor was so ill with fever that Martha sat awake, convinced she would lose her daughter. There was a year when the traps produced less fur than usual, and they had to be careful with their resources. The isolation could be difficult. Martha, though she had grown to love the mountains, occasionally missed the company of other women and the connection to a wider world. But there was also profound joy. There was the morning Eleanor took her first steps, and Elias caught her, laughing in pure delight. There was the evening James, barely 3 years old, said his first full sentence, "Mama loved Papa," and watched his parents embrace. There were the nights when the northern lights danced across the sky, and the whole family stood outside in their nightclothes, watching the green light shimmer above them. There were the small moments of domestic peace, Martha singing while she prepared dinner, Elias teaching Eleanor how to identify animal tracks, the warmth of the fire, the sound of their children's laughter. By the time Eleanor was school age, the story of Elias Boone and Martha Hale had become something of a legend in Timber Creek. The mountain man who lived alone for 20 years, the mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere and transformed him. The love story that had unfolded in the isolation of the mountains. One autumn afternoon, when Elias was 58 and Martha was 36, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the aspens turn gold. Eleanor was at a neighbor's cabin. Martha had made friends in town, and James was napping inside. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked. "Staying here with me? You could have had a different life." Martha took his hand, noting the lines in his face, the gray in his beard, the permanence of him. Elias had gone from being a man running from pain to being a man who had stopped running. He had found healing through love and family, and Martha had found the same. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You taught me that work with someone you love is never a burden. You taught me that kindness is real, that trust can be earned, that a life of meaning doesn't require wealth or status or approval from others. You taught me that when you work together, really together, you can build something that nothing can destroy." Elias pulled her close, and they stood watching the mountains shift through their seasonal changes, much as they had done for 15 years now. The young woman who had collapsed on his doorstep, broken and desperate, had become the partner of his later years. The isolated man who had thought himself incapable of love had become a husband, a father, a member of a community, not because he had to be, but because he had discovered that connection and purpose were more vital than solitude. The mountains still stood around them, eternal and unchanging, but the lives that unfolded beneath them had transformed completely. And in the cabin, warmed by firelight and filled with the simple sounds of family life, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of a sleeping child, the gentle conversation of two people who had learned to trust each other completely, there was a kind of peace that neither Elias nor Martha had thought possible. The story of the mountain man and the woman who arrived in winter had no need for heroic drama or tragic endings. It was something more valuable. It was a story of ordinary transformation, of two broken people finding wholeness through commitment, work, and love. It was proof that in the wilderness you could find not only survival, but genuine belonging.